it's Caitlin from C-SPAN. Did you know that C-SPAN has been serving the American people for 45 years? Since our founding in 1979, C-SPAN has been documenting history with a unique approach, unfiltered, without commentary, and entirely independent from government funding. C-SPAN is funded by fees from our cable and satellite distribution partners. And now, with fewer people subscribing to cable and satellite, we're asking you to help support our next 45. Your contribution helps to ensure that we can continue to provide unfiltered, complete coverage of government proceedings on TV, online, on radio, and our mobile app, as well as context through newsletters, social media, and podcasts. Join us in preserving this legacy of access to the democratic process. Make your tax-deductible donation today at cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
On About Books, we delve into the latest news about the publishing industry with interesting insider interviews with publishing industry experts. We'll also give you updates on current nonfiction authors and books, the latest book reviews, and we'll talk about the current nonfiction books featured on C-SPAN's Book TV. And now joining us on Book TV is author Jonah Winter. He is a children's book author. He's written over 40 children's books, many award-winning, mostly published by Random House. Topics include Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Roberto Clemente, Willie Mays, Sonia Sotomayor, Barack Obama, Muhammad Ali, Hillary Clinton, Thurgood Marshall, etc., etc. What kind of children's books do you write, Mr. Winter?
Well, I write on about a broad range of topics, but generally what I have been writing about until a few years ago, I should say what I had been writing about were books about people who don't share my identity. So a lot of books on people of color, books on women, books about racial and social justice. I write books about baseball players and artists and musicians. I write children's book nonfiction, picture book biographies, picture book nonfiction specifically. And recently, the last few years, I've been writing more fiction for reasons having to do with certain changes in the publishing world and in my career. But that's generally the sort of books I've been writing. But my first book was about Diego Rivera, published in 1991. And that kind of was before there was a category in bookstores, a section of bookstores called picture book biographies. So I've been doing this for a while.
Well, and recently in the Dallas Morning News, you wrote a column. And in that column, you wrote, "I am acquainted with censorship from both the political right and left." What were you referring to?
Well, to begin with the first part of your question, the censorship from the political right is covered a lot in the news. You see lots of news stories these days about right-wing book banning in right-wing school districts in Florida, Texas, even the state where I live, Pennsylvania. And so I am familiar with that. I've had a few books banned. My book on Roberto Clemente was banned last year. That was the reason I was asked to write that piece for the Dallas Morning News. It was banned in Duval County, Florida, along with a lot of other books, and it became quite a national news story because a lot of people were surprised that a book on Roberto Clemente, of all people, would be banned. But I also had a book on Sotomayor, which was banned right here in the state where I live, Pennsylvania, in York County. I was on a book tour for my book Hillary, about Hillary Clinton, in 2016, and was met at the door of two schools there by the principal. I felt I was maybe going to have to go to the principal's office. It was a kind of a tense scene. And I was told that I could not present my book, Hillary, to the children in that school, even though I was on a book tour for that book and they had known in advance. So I would count that as, in my experience, of right-wing book banning, right-wing censorship. But what I have experienced from the left is a lot more insidious, and I would argue a lot more damaging. And it isn't covered as much in the news, or at least not in mainstream news. It's certainly probably covered a lot on Fox News and news sources that from right-wing places, and it's generally referred to as cancel culture. And I have experienced that. I've had a book of mine piled on in 2017 um, called The Secret Project. I wrote a piece about it in the New York Times by left-wing critics, I guess you could call them that. Well, it's more like a mob, though, who pounced on my book saying that I had erased Native Americans. It was a book about the making of the atom bomb. I had not erased Native Americans from this book, but what started as a book that had gotten 5-star reviews and was predicted for a Caldecott quickly became a book that was like kryptonite, and that no one wanted to touch it, and it kind of got disappeared. Well, I've had contracts canceled. Very much not that when they were canceled, they weren't news items. This wasn't something that was written about in the news. It happened behind the scenes. The 2 contracts were canceled because my identity did not match the identities of the subject matter. One was a book on contract for a book on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that the publisher felt that because another book was coming out on this topic by a Jewish woman, my book could not compete with that. In the other instance, there was a book I'd written about a slave owner, a little known historic figure who freed his enslaved people in what amounted to the largest emancipation in history before the Civil War. And this book got canceled simply because the editor became worried, because of various things that were happening in the children's book world, became worried about what the perception would be of a white male children's book author writing about a white male slave owner published by a white male editor. And so he canceled, well, the book got canceled by that publishing company.
Well,
so
I want to walk through some of these examples, Mr. Winter, and let's start with Roberto Clemente in Duval County, Jacksonville, Florida. When you say that book was banned, who banned it and why?
Well, it was banned by the school district, and the answer why is sort of an interesting question. I think now, look at it from the perspective of 1 year later, I think that the people who removed this and 173 other titles, books from the shelves in the schools in that district, I think they were doing it as a form of creative protest to Governor Ron DeSantis's new law, the sort of the anti-woke law that was put into place, making it a crime to present books on certain topics that covered, say, sexuality, gender identification, racism. And so they removed all these books I think probably for the purpose of drawing attention to that. At the time, it seemed like they were doing this simply because they were being good soldiers and just following the law and removing all the books that needed to be removed. But certainly their impetus for doing this was legitimate. I mean, DeSantis was making it a crime, and still is, to present books on the topics I mentioned to children in public schools. So that was the reason.
And when you say banned, they were removed from the libraries, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting distinction. When you hear this talked about, especially in right-wing contexts, there's always this distinction made between banning and removing a book from the shelves. My attitude is that if you remove a book from a bookshelf in a public school for ideological reasons, that amounts to banning it. A lot of people define the word banning in a more strict way to say banning can only be done by a country outlawing a specific title. But yes, that's what I'm referring to.
So in Duval County, when this happened, this made the news, correct? There was a lot of media about this.
There was, I mean, up to the point where at one point Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, was holding the book in the House chambers, waving it in the air as an example of how the overreach of the right wing in censoring books for kids, because of a book on Roberto Clemente could be banned, then anything could be banned. So yeah, it became a pretty big news item.
What happened to the sales of the book?
Well, for that period, they went up. I mean, I went on to Amazon to check the sales rank, and it was as if the book was had just come out and were a bestseller. I mean, and I was being contacted by various news people from various states, and various organizations were interested in talking to me, and people were saying they were going to buy hundreds of these books to distribute to schools, that ban books. So it provided a lot of free publicity and visibility. And it did so almost 20 years after its publication date. I mean, it's stayed in print and done really well through the years. It's a Common Core book, and it's survived, but that was really a shot in the arm.
Jonah Winter, I want to go back to your Dallas Morning News column and quote again. What hurts a book or an author is the far more effective cancel culture of the left, who've commandeered both liberalism in general and the publishing world specifically, often using their power to attack well-meaning authors in the form of social media pile-ons and the resulting cancellations. Could you explain how this impacted you personally?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it impacted me with a book I wrote called The Secret Project about the making of the atom bomb, a book an experience I wrote about in the New York Times Book Review. It as much as the book had been getting rave reviews, and then suddenly it got attacked by a very popular social media figure who had a lot of followers who kind of piled on and joined in the condemnation of this book, if you want to call it that. And after that, no one wanted to touch this book. It was, it had been predicted for a Caldecott. Well, it wasn't going to get one anymore. The publisher really wasn't interested in promoting it anymore at that point, because it had been at the center of a social media firestorm. So, after I wrote a piece about this in the New York Times 2 years later, I myself experienced the joys of more pile-ons. I was singled out on a website called Reading While White. It's a website run by left-wing white people who like to attack and pile on other left-wing white people such as myself. And they put me on a sort of blacklist after that my New York Times piece came out, accusing me and other authors of racism in words, works, and deeds. Well, I mean, I've devoted my life to educating children about racism and to promoting racial justice through my books. So it was, I was pretty upset about this. But then, right around that same time, I was told by my main editor at Random House that she could no longer publish any more books by me on people of color, women, and of course not on white men, because no one wants any books about white men anymore. That was the implication there. And she said, "I get it, Jonah. You're totally," and then she used a word I can't use on TV. But those are some of the examples of ways I've been impacted by this, and contracts canceled also, because my identity did not align with the subject matter.
And you talk in your column about two terms, lived experiences and own voices. What does that mean?
Well, own voices was the original term that came along in 2015 to promote the idea that writers should stay in their lane. They should not write outside their own experiences. And specifically, writers from quote unquote empowered culture, whatever that culture might be, should not write about people from the marginalized culture. And so own voices became a very popular term. And in fact, it was used in some rejection letters I got from a manuscript I wrote about Colin Kaepernick. And one of the editors said, "I have a hashtag own voices problem with this manuscript," meaning I'm not allowed to write about this. And in fact, another editor just came out and said, "No, this subject matter does not belong to you. You don't get to write about that." So that's what own voices mean. The reason I'm not quite sure why that term was abandoned, but various people who were promoting the term said it was being weaponized against the people it was supposed to help. So they decided it was not a useful term anymore, and it got replaced by lived experience, which I have to say I don't think just linguistically I don't think it's an improvement because the term lived experience implies that you have to, as an author, have lived the experience you're writing about in order to have the right to write about that topic, which means that nobody gets to write about anything except for themselves, except memoir. I mean, if you were going to follow the logic of that term to its illogical conclusion, you would have to say that a contemporary Black person would not be allowed to write about slavery because they didn't live that experience. So those are those two terms, and the one lived experience is the one far more in favor right now.
Where do you think the lived experience, own voices movement came from?
Well, it came from an idea well, I would say it came from a sort of pseudo-Marxist idea about subject matter belonging to certain people and literature being a power struggle in which certain subject matter, like cultural subject matter, has been appropriated by those people in power. So that the idea was that these new rules, and by the way, they are rules that are generally in place in the publishing industry right now. The publishers have been pressured into putting them into place. But these new rules were supposed to correct that injustice by deciding who gets to write about what. So that's why they were created. I mean, I must add to that though that creating rules about what authors can and can't write about creates a kind of totalitarian state of things. Because when you start doing that, when you start limiting what authors can write about, you're basically veering towards the Stalinist Soviet Union, where only certain topics can get talked about, and people who break the rules get sent away.
Jonah Winter, do you consider yourself to be politically liberal?
Extremely. I am a lifelong liberal. I've been a liberal my whole life, and I as such I don't find these new developments at all liberal. I would call them illiberal. And but yes, I mean in first grade I got in trouble in my school, which was at a right-wing school district, for wearing a peace button on my lapel. I've been going to demonstrations since I was in high school, anti-war protests. I am always voted Democrat. I have devoted, I would say, my career as a children's book author to the liberal cause of getting across information about people of color, about racial justice, about women, about people from all over the world that might be excluded from the curriculums and the schools across this country. So yes, I am an unabashed liberal.
Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Dallas, Texas, which is what a big part of what turned me into a liberal, because I was born in 1962. I was on my father's shoulders when the day Kennedy came to Dallas and was assassinated. So I grew up in the shadow of that, and in the era of the John Birch Society. It was Dallas, which has become apparently quite a left-leaning city at this point. It was not that when I was growing up there. And the particular neighborhood where I grew up was just as racist and right-wing as it could be, and intolerant of any kind of nonconformity, which made my life kind of challenging at times growing up there. But it also helped shape who I am. I mean, I'm a liberal and I'm a nonconformist, and that shaped a lot of what I've devoted my life to and who I am as a person. So,
how did you become a children's author?
It was a total accident, actually. I had gone to graduate school to study poetry. I write poetry for adults when I'm not writing children's books. And my mother is a children's book illustrator and author, and she has been this children's book illustrator since I was like 6 years old. So I knew about this whole business. I had actually my first job out of college was in the publishing world, and working as a children's book editorial assistant and assistant editor. But what got me into writing children's books is a poetry reading I gave, in which I was presenting these I write a lot of kind of silly poems for adults. And one of them was a series of book reports written from the point of view of a misinformed, illiterate 10-year-old boy. And one of the book reports that I read was on Diego Rivera, which my mother was trying to write a book about at the time and struggling because she hadn't really written books at that point. And this was 1989, 1990. So she asked me to write the text for this, and I did, and it got published, and it did really well. It's still in print, and so it was kind of an accident, really.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about social media and its impact. You wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal regarding your experiences as well. I want to quote from that. What mattered was that a social media mob could force major publishers to stop distributing a book. My career will likely suffer more damage because of what I've written here. So be it. The impact of social media, Mr. Winter.
Well, I would argue that it's been horrible. It has led to various kinds of censorship, including self-censorship. Authors and editors now live in fear of being attacked on social media. They live in fear of the social media mob. And at this point, I would say most of the lessons taught to us by the social media mob have been absorbed, so that now the publishers have these rules in place, like lived experience, for instance, and authors are self-censoring. I mean, there's also been examples of self-cancellation due to social media pressure, but I think the even more dangerous effect, the symptom of social media involvement in the children's book world, is the self-censorship. The the notion that you always have this censor perched on your shoulder, looking over every word that you're typing and thinking, "Oh, am I allowed to say that? Could I say that? No, I'm not allowed to say that." And that is not a way that good literature happens. And for literature to happen, for any literature to happen, authors have to be free to say whatever they want to say without fear of reprisal, without fear of career ruination, without fear of getting attacked and becoming so unpopular that no publishers want to touch them. That's what needs to happen. Social media, I think, is the people who are using social media for this purpose is responsible for so much of what has happened in the children's book world, which, I mean, there are a lot of people who believe that what's happened in the children's book world is wonderful. I'm not one of these people, obviously.
Have you found yourself self-censoring?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Not in the essays that I write. I mean, I pretty much decided that in the essays I write, I'm just going to say exactly what I think and hope that someone publishes them. But in my children's book manuscripts, I mean, I look through, like, I often keep index cards full of ideas for children's books, and I go through that list and think, no, can't do that. No one's going to publish that. No, too dark. Oh, no, too. I can't. I'm not allowed to say that. Problematic. So absolutely. I mean, I have, I've tried to come up with manuscripts that I think that I would be allowed to publish, but then sometimes I don't even send those out because I don't see the point.
Is it safer as a children's author to write about animals?
Yes, and in fact, one of my former main editor, that's what she highly read. The one who told me she couldn't publish any more books by me on people of color or women or white men, said you should really think about writing about animals, and specifically, she suggested the following topic: the last white rhinoceros, which she suggested without a trace of irony. And I burst out laughing when she suggested this, but it wasn't a joke. I mean, to me, it sounds like a really, like almost a satirical name for a really sad memoir. The last white rhinoceros, Jonah Winter tells his story. But yeah, I've been told that I should write about animals, and in fact, I have started writing about animals. I have a book coming out about birds this next month called Bird Rehearsal, which I think I have a copy of right here. And this is a manuscript I wrote kind of in response to all of this. I mean, I thought, well, if I can't write about people, I love birds. I'm going to write about birds. And I sent this manuscript out to a couple of, or my agent, former agent, sent this out to a couple of editors who didn't quite like it enough to publish it. And then she kind of got cold feet about sending it out anymore. And she showed it to her assistant, who looked at this manuscript that is just about birds to see, what might be wrong with it, that it hasn't gotten published yet. And he it's just about birds and bird songs, but he was looking through it and saying, and I saw his thoughts on this. He said, I kept thinking that maybe a diversity, equity, and inclusion theme would arise in this book about birds. And then there was a bird on a telephone wire, and I thought, oh, maybe there's going to be an environmentalist theme that's going to hold this together. But no, it's just about birds. Well, long story short, I insisted that we keep sending this manuscript out, and an editor did publish it. But one of the first things she did before publishing it was suggest that I take out all the text, all of my writing, except for the bird songs, which I did. So now the only text in this book is like chickadee-dee-dee and puck, 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 puck. And you know what? I think that was the most brilliant suggestion that could have been made in regard to this book. I'm very happy that this book was published. The illustrations are beautiful. It was illustrated by my friend and former collaborator, Stacy Innerst, and he and I collaborated on the Ruth Bader Ginsburg book, which finally did get published by Abrams, who also coming out with this book. And I couldn't be happier. So maybe I'll just keep publishing books about birds. I don't know. I like birds.
Well, Jonah Winter, you also talk about the industry, the publishing industry, and in the Heresy Press newsletter, you wrote, "Fear has prompted publishers to avoid taking chances on any potentially controversial books. This is a major departure. Since books were first published, publishers took chances on books that might offend certain people, and often these books have helped move literature forward."
Yes. Well, that is the history of literature right there. I mean, Ulysses. Well, what if a publisher would have said, "Well, I don't know. There's no book like this out, really. Where's the precedent for this? And this is going to offend people. So I don't know." I mean, the right to offend is a fundamental right of literature. It's the foundation for freedom of speech, and it's the foundation for a lot of literature. I mean, books. Most books are going to offend someone, I think, especially in this day and age, because this is the age of getting offended by things. The idea of not publishing a book because it might offend someone is an enormous. It's a sea change in how books are published.
Award-winning children's author Jonah Winter, author of over 40 children's books. We appreciate your time on Book TV.
Thank you very much.